In this video, I'll be talking about emulating vintage computers, like vintage computers that use the MS-DOS and the Microsoft Windows platform. So this is the timeline of the hardware specs. So for this one, this is 1988 to 1994. This is 1994 to 1996, and so on and so forth. So first I'll be talking about emulating MS-DOS games from Microsoft Windows 5.0 to Microsoft Windows 6.22, which was the latest version of Microsoft DOS, which was released in 1994. So from the DOS era, you would probably be emulating a 286 12 megahertz computer to a 486DX 33 megahertz computer. So this is in the MS-DOS era. So the type of graphics card you would need is, I guess, anywhere from CGA to Super VGA, but EGA 16 color is probably what most games ran at back in 1987, 88, 89, and after that it was VGA, then Super VGA, and the amount of RAM was about 640 kbytes, or that's 0.64 megabytes to about 16 megabytes on probably a 486 with a EISA motherboard. So EISA was a 32-bit bus motherboard. Some 386DXs had EISA motherboards, while others didn't. So if it didn't have EISA, then it would be running at a 16-bit bus speed. But the processor's 486 processor was a 32-bit processor, and I think the 386DX was also a 32-bit processor. But a lot of the motherboards at the time, maybe in the late 1980s and early 1990s, were only had 16-bit bus on it. So RAM is 640 kbytes to 16 megabytes around this period. Hard drive is, I guess, anywhere from 10 megabytes to 200 megabytes. 200 megabytes for, I guess, 486s and stuff like that. And you have floppy disks in this period, which was from 3.5 inch high density 1.44 megabyte to 5.25 inch 1.22 megabyte floppy disks. So some computers had both floppy disks, but as time went by, the 5.25 inch disk was phased out and people were using more 3.5 inch floppy disks as time went by. And then they had 2.44 megabyte floppy disks as well, but that wasn't as popular. And you had the OS was, of course, Microsoft Windows 5.0 to Microsoft Windows 6.22, and the type of emulators you could use to emulate games from this time period would be a very popular one called DOSBox 0.74, and you could use PCEM. If you can find the BIOS for the computers, like a 386, 286, 486, or whatever, you could, or an AMD equivalent to a 486, Cyrex equivalent to a 486, or whatever, you could do that. And you could use a PCM or 86 box. And I made tutorial videos about this, and I'll leave them in the video descriptions below if you're interested. But from this period, I preferred DOSBox 0.74. But I did run DOS games emulating 386 SX 16 megahertz using PCEM around this period. Also, for computer hardware specs from 1994 to 1996, The CPUs would be from a Pentium 90 megahertz to a Pentium 120 megahertz. So Intel Pentium. So that was the CPU specs around that time. And the graphics card would be a Super VGA Vesa graphics card, or a S3 Virge GX or DX. I think it's a Super VGA card. It did have some 3D capabilities, 3D acceleration capabilities. And the amount of RAM was 8 to 32 megabytes EDO RAM. Hard drive capacity was about 250 megabytes to 850 megabytes. So the hard drive capacity is correlated to the software that was available at the time, because if you didn't have because the software volume got bigger as time went by, as processors got more powerful. The size of the software in terms of megabytes and was greater. And we still had floppy disk drives, 1.44 megabyte to 5.25, 1.22 megabytes. And floppy disks were used because you had, if you wanted to install an operating system on a computer, you needed to use a startup disk to do that back in the day, and you needed to use a program called Fdisk to partition the hard drive and stuff like that. Same with this era, you needed to use a startup disk as well in 1988 to 1994 as well. And the operating system was Windows 3.11 or Windows 95. Because back in 1994, I got a Pentium 100 megahertz, and that computer came with Windows 3.11. It also had DOS on it as well. And the best emulators you could use to emulate the hardware from that period would be something called DOSBox Pure, which I made a tutorial video on recently, PCM 86 box as well. And computer hardware specs from 1997 to 1998. These CPUs would be maybe something like an AMD K6, which I didn't put here, a Cyrex processor. I'm not really familiar with those, but all I know is they had equivalents to a Pentium for IBM Cyrex and AMD as well. And they had the K6 or a K5 series as well. It's like a Pentium, but they had less float point power than a Intel processor. So it's 166 MMX to 233 MMX. You also had Pentium Pros in this period, which was a lot more powerful than a regular Pentium chip. And you had graphics card was Virge DX to 386 DX Voodoo with 4 megabytes of RAM. And you had other video card like NVIDIA Riva cards and stuff like that. STB Velocity 128 and other video cards of that type. You had the NEC Matrox video card, 3D accelerators. But in this period of time, for some reason, the 3D accelerator was not a standalone video solution. So you needed to have a graphics card, like something like an S3 Virge DX. And you needed to have and you connected this to your video card and connected it to your computer monitor. So that's how it worked back then. So the amount of RAM was 32 megabytes to 128 megabytes of SD RAM in this period. So hard drive space was 1 gigabyte to 2 gigabyte. And these are IDE hard drives. Floppy disks, 3.5 inch 1.44 or 3.5 inch 2.88. But the formats were in 1.44. I don't think I ever encountered a disk that had 2.88 megabytes for a 3.5 inch floppy drive around this period. And the operating system was Windows 95 for most computers around this timeline. And the best emulators to use for this time period would be DOSBox Pure, PCM 86 box. I found that it's much better to use DOSBox Pure compared to these two emulators below because of the fact that there's less lag in DOSBox Pure. It's a lot faster. That's one thing I like about it. It doesn't use as much hardware, CPU power, because PCM and 86 box tried to emulate every cycle of computer at that period, and that does require a lot of CPU power, and you need to have a very powerful computer to run it flawlessly. So even if the percentage of even if the efficiency is at only 97% or 96%, you're still going to have some issues with the sound. They're kind of like stutters and stuff like that. You hear like little glitch sounds. So that's one thing I don't like about PCM and 86 box. Even if you have a very powerful computer, it still has some sound problems. And computer hardware specs from late 1998 to 1999. This will be the Windows 98 era. The processors that you'd be using is a Pentium 2 233 megahertz to a Pentium 2 450 megahertz. I think these were slot 1. And at that time I had I think I first had a Celeron 400. The motherboard I was using was an 8-bit BE6. It was a slot 1 motherboard, and I upgraded it from a Celeron 400 to a Pentium 2 400, and I upgraded that later to a Pentium 3 550. And then I upgraded it from a Pentium 3 550 to a Pentium 3 850 later in 1999. So the graphics card is S3 Virge DX 386 2 to 8 Voodoo 2 8 megabyte to 12 megabyte. And we could also add a Voodoo 3 2000 to maybe 3500 video card as well, with about 16 megabytes of RAM. And RAM would be from 186 to 256 megabytes of SD RAM. And hard drive was from 2 gigabyte to 4 gigabyte IDE hard drive. Floppy disk 3.5 inch 1.44 megabytes, and we still did use start Windows 98 startup disk during this period. We stopped using the startup disks when we entered Windows XP era, which was in late 2000 or something like that. Let me check. Windows XP release date. It was 2001. So from 2001 August on, when Windows XP was released, we no longer needed to use startup disk anymore to install Windows. So the best emulator for this period from late 1998 to 1999 would be PCM version 12 to 86 and 86 box, which support Pentium 2 processors. So let's talk about. We'll be talking about the type of games that would run on computers with different computer specs. So from 1994 to 1996, we're probably using Windows 3.11 or Windows 95. So a game like Command and Conquer, Hex and Beyond, Heretic, Sid Meier's Civilization 2, Star Wars TIE Fighter, Star Wars Dark Forces, Warcraft 2, Wing Commander, Privateer would be the typical games that you would be running around this period of time on something like a Pentium 90 megahertz to Pentium 120 megahertz. And these games didn't have 3D acceleration at the time, but they did require a Vesa graphics card to run. Not required, but you could run it on SVGA, but it ran a lot better on Vesa video cards. And we could put Mech Warrior 2 in this mix as well. And you could run games like this on, I guess, something like DOSBox Pure. But it was kind of like Windows 95 era, but without the 3D acceleration, we could say. So from 1997 to 1998, we had games like Age of Empires, Blood by Monolith, Grand Theft Auto, Quake 2. Quake 1 was here, but it didn't have 3D acceleration. But from Quake 2, we had 3D acceleration. Blood didn't have 3D acceleration, but it was still a game that was made around this period. Dark Forces 2 did have 3D acceleration. Star Wars Shadow of the Empire, 3D acceleration was supported. Turok Dinosaur Hunter, 3D acceleration was supported, and Glide was supported, and so was it was the same for Wing Commander Prophecy. All these games. And we had Wing Commander 3 and Wing Commander 4 that would belong in this era. That did not have any 3D acceleration in it. And it would run on DOS as well. As well as Windows as well. So computer hardware from late 1998 to 1999. There's a Pentium 2 era, 233 megahertz to Pentium 2 450. We had games like Blood 2 The Chosen, Fallout 2, that didn't require 3D acceleration, Grand Theft Auto 2, Luftwaffe Commander required it, 3D acceleration. So all of these games required it, except for like real-time strategy games like StarCraft. Didn't require it. But this was the timeline when first-person shooters were very popular. And 3D accelerated games were also very popular. So hardware specs from mid-1990 to 2000. So we had games like Age of Empires 2, Age of Kings. This didn't have 3D acceleration, but it did require a pretty powerful processor. I think you needed at least a Pentium 3 550 to run this game without having your computer bogged down. You had EverQuest, Half-Life, Opposing Forces, Homeworld, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, Star Wars, X-Wing Alliance, System Shock 2, Unreal Tournament. So in this period of time, we did have some Pentium 4s come out, early Pentium 4s, but most games in this period of time could be run on a Pentium 3, and they ran pretty good on a Pentium 3. I didn't have any problems running any games from this period on a Pentium 3 550 or a 850. So let's take a look at some of the games. So this is Caesar 2. I used DOSBox 0.7 to emulate it. As you heard there's no sound distortions or anything. This thing ran perfectly. There's no problems running it on DOSBox 0.74. And I ran this on 86 box, emulating an Pentium 2 overdrive 233 megahertz.
Okay, it's playable. No problems. For a retro game.
Try using your harpoon and tow cables on the ATA. Go for your target for the harpoon.
Perfectly playable, but it does have some sound stuttering, sound distortions. And I ran it on a pretty fast computer, an i7 4790K. This, I ran it on DOSBox Pure, running Windows 98 2nd edition. It is a little slow. There was some stuttering. Let me see. This one I ran Turok on PCM version 13.1.
Don't screw this up.
After this plays out, let me see. And I didn't have any problems running this game. I was more like a stability test that I ran on it. No sound glitches or anything. Ran perfectly. I was emulating a Pentium 166 MMX. And I ran this on a i5 3590K using a GeForce GTX 1070 8GB. Ran pretty smoothly for the most part. And this one, I emulated a Pentium 2 450, which was the best CPU you could emulate on PCM version 17. I ran this on a i7 10700KF processor with a MSI GeForce GTX 772GB.
Contact with civilian.
Get your hands on the ground. Drop to your knees. Do it.
Right 3, level 3.
Straight ahead.
Just past the attic window.
So it ran okay, but when I played this game, I ran it on a Pentium 3 550, and it was not very smooth. And here I emulated a 450 and it ran okay. This is about what I would expect it to run, emulating a Pentium 2 450, and it was a real struggle trying to emulate a Pentium 2 450. It wouldn't run at 100%. So you'll need a really powerful computer trying to emulate something like a Pentium 3 550 or above, because this emulator is very taxing on the CPU. And here I ran another game running PCM, running SimCity 3000. This game was released in 1999.
Okay, it appears to be working. So that's it. That's how you get SimCity 3000 to run on PCM. I don't want to save it. That's it. Shut down Windows. Right. So anyways, thank you.
Okay, see, 1999.
KS 1975.
So this game ran okay, actually. And let me see. I also did a stability test on this, running it for a while to see if it would crash or not. And it was pretty stable on PCM. And when I played this game, I had a Pentium 3 850 on it when I played this game. And it ran very smoothly, but here I was emulating a 450 Pentium 2. And it wasn't as smooth from what I remembered it compared to a Pentium 3 850. But it ran okay. So I was just demonstrating that you could emulate games from 1998 to 1999 using PCM version 17. So that's not what this video was about, but this video was about SimCity 3000. But I emulated it on a PCM version 17 on using a i7 10700 KF based processor. It ran okay. And these are DOS games that I used PCM, emulating a 386 SX. It ran pretty good. I didn't have any problems with it. I ran it for about 49 minutes until I got tired of playing it, and it seemed pretty stable. There's no real problems with it. It just ran very, very smoothly, and it ran like the 386 computer that I used back in the early 1990s. In terms of the emulation, it was more accurate than, I guess, DOSBox 0.74. Because that's what the emulators like PCM and the 86 box tried to do. They tried to replicate the hardware from back in the day. So this is Crime Wave on PCM using MS-DOS 5.0, emulating a 386 SX 16 MHz. It runs pretty smoothly. I mean, a modern computer should not have any problems trying to emulate a 386 SX or a 386 DX, 486, or anything like that using MS-DOS. So this ran pretty good. It ran like the actual hardware that I had back in 1990. So as for emulating computer hardware from, I guess, 1988 to 1999, because we can't go this far because we don't have support for these type of processors. The three that you could use is you could use 86-box PCM and DOSBox Pure, and they all ran well. And also DOSBox 0.74, that would be for the DOS games. But DOSBox 0.74, the emulation for it isn't authentic. However, you could get the games to run on it, and you could play DOS games on it, and that's the good thing about it. And it's not very hard to use. For PCM and 86-box, it does require a lot more technical skills to get it installed. As for DOSBox Pure, you don't really need any technical skills to get it installed. It was pretty easy to install. Anybody should be able to do that. And that's my take on the type of computer emulators that you can use to emulate to various versions of MS-DOS, Windows up to Windows 98, and stuff like that. So if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comment section below.